Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Noel, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are the session titled Closing Adaptation Knowledge Gaps to Scale Nature-Based Action in the Asia Pacific region. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, your participation using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen is highly encouraged. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Closing Adaptation Knowledge Gaps to Scale Nature-Based Action in the Asia-Pacific region. We are ready to get started. I will now pass the floor to Elvin Chandra, Program Management Officer at UNEP. Elvin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noel. Ladies and gentlemen, Bula, Namaste, good afternoon, good morning, and evening, wherever you're joining us from the region. It is great that you've managed to log in and join us today for this really exciting panel conversation. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 7th APEN session, which is focusing on closing adaptation knowledge gaps to scale up nature-based action in the Asia-Pacific region. As Noel mentioned, I'm Elvin Chandra from UN Environment Program, and I'm very delighted and excited to be moderating this very relevant session that is focusing on closing adaptation gaps. So it's been only 2 weeks ago that the UN Secretary General launched the Making Peace with Nature scientific report. He emphasized that everyone has a role to play in a relationship with nature. He emphasized that we need to ensure that knowledge, technology, and cooperation, they go hand in hand, and that they're key to transforming nature-based actions and solutions, but also to transform our relationship with nature. And what more opportunistic way than to have this conversation on addressing knowledge gaps to scale up nature-based action. Today, we've got a fantastic set of speakers who will share their very rich insights and learnings from Samoa, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, Vanuatu, and Bhutan. But before we kick off, I want to mention that we want to keep this session very interactive. So use the chats, use this opportunity to ask questions to the speakers and the panelists through the chat room. We also want you to make most out of this session. So I encourage you to engage with us via Menti in the second part of the session. And just in case you have any internet connectivity issues, we'd like to share the Menti code with you now. So log onto your computers and to your mobile phones and go to www.menti.com and use the code 17887035. And I'll repeat that code again, 17887035. So in part 2 of this event, we will have 2 national experts who will be reflecting on your answers and share their experiences building on your responses. To kick off this session, I am very pleased to welcome Mr. Yusuf Nassef, who is the Director, Adaptation Division at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, to open the event. Yusuf has sent through a video recording as his opening remarks. So over to Yusuf. Noel and Hems, over to you to share Yusuf's message. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. On behalf of the conveners of the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, UNEP and UNFCCC, I would like to welcome you all to this event on the application of the LAKI to the Asia-Pacific region. We have recently undertaken 3 exercises to apply the LAKI prioritization process for knowledge gaps in the Asia-Pacific region. One of them took place in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, and the other for the Indian Ocean Islands, and the third, which is the most recent one, for the Pacific Islands subregion. Now, the LAKI being a joint initiative between UNEP and UNFCCC, we have been interfacing continuously with APAN, the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, as well as with the Global Adaptation Network, and we look forward to this continued engagement as the LAKI expands. But let me talk first about a few characteristics of the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, which makes it a bit more different than other activities we've been undertaking in the UN system. First, the LAKI is very unique in that it focuses on the low-hanging fruit, the lowest hanging fruit that could help practitioners bridge into a scaled-up adaptation context. And that is the removal of knowledge gaps that could be detrimental to progress in adaptation. Second is the innovative methodology that's used. It's very rigorous, and at the same time, it is not constraining. So for each sub-region, a selected group of criteria are defined and weights for this criteria that differentiate them from other regions. But in general, they all follow the same overarching steps and principles of the methodology. So there's replicability, but there's still a form of mass customization depending on the region in question. Now, the third is that the LAKI employs the most effective group of stakeholders that would ensure maximum benefit from the exercise, starting from the best possible experts that can define the knowledge gaps and prioritize them and select the criteria and weight them, all the way to the sub-regional cooperation entities who are our direct counterpart in the sub-region for moving this forward. And finally, in the implementation stage, we would also have additional international and regional entities coming in to support the implementation of actions that could help remove those knowledge barriers. Third is the choice of subregions. I mean, these are not intended to be politically motivated, but rather these are subregions with shared climatic characteristics and vulnerabilities. So it makes sense to bring these people together for that particular geographic area. And having said that, once we go into implementation, I see a lot of synergies presenting itself, and we have experiences from already having embarked on implementation of activities in other regions. So there are synergies with ongoing activities that may be in place, supported by international entities or otherwise, and so there's an opportunity for knowledge proofing these activities towards supporting the identified priorities in the LAKI. There are also synergies possible across sub-regions, and we're seeing some similarities in gaps interregionally. And so with time, and as the sub-regions grow, now we only have 7, with time we'll be able to find ways of cross-fertilization of activities across sub-regions as we fill these gaps. And there are also synergies across activities to fill knowledge gaps within the same sub-region, because they're not always siloed and stand alone. So as we move forward, we see all kinds of possible collaborative contexts through which we can actually achieve a lot more than originally envisioned, not least because of the whole engagement that's happening with the different entities, with the different organizations, whether sub-regional or regional or international, that get involved together to move forward this context of removing knowledge gaps. And so I'm very happy that we have this event today, which will look at the Asia-Pacific experience, and you will hear from our distinguished panelists their experience with the application of the LAKI, their experience generally with adaptation knowledge and with adaptation knowledge gaps, and also with activities that are being undertaken to remove these knowledge gaps. And so the next step, after we have sort of digested the prioritized gaps is to create partnerships and to create the necessary enabling environment for these gaps to be filled. So the implementation stage is very important, and we will be calling upon all the regional organizations that can help with supporting and can help with implementing activities that can move us then to a context where these knowledge gaps are no longer barriers to the implementation of adaptation action at ground level. So with this, once again, I would like to thank you very much for being here and to welcome you to this event, and best of luck. Thank you.
It is always a pleasure hearing from Yusuf, and a hearty thank you to Yusuf for sharing an overview of the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, or LAKI in short. It is encouraging to hear that we're already embarking on implementation. It's also encouraging to learn that we already have a range of stakeholders and there's synergies across different subregions. It's also very opportunistic to say that, well, we are now identifying but also addressing knowledge gaps. So audience participants, colleagues, as it reiterated by Yusuf, in spite of a growing understanding of adaptation, knowledge of adaptation, we find that knowledge gaps still remain as a critical barrier to countries, particularly that towards implementing adaptation measures. Therefore, the LAKI has been developed as a joint endeavor between the UN Environment Programme through the Global Adaptation Network and the UN Climate Change Secretariat as a knowledge to action hub on adaptation and resilience. And in very short, it's called the Nairobi Work Program. The Action Hub, along with the Nairobi Work Program, has many partners in the region. And this really provides us with opportunities to address and strengthen our approach to adaptation by addressing knowledge gaps. Very, very quickly, I would like to very briefly mention the objectives of the session. So it's threefold. We want to hear from our experts and from colleagues in the region to share through some of the lessons that are coming from the Asia Pacific region and highlight the importance of context-specific knowledge for target users. Second, it is our hope that the session will generate new insights, particularly to close some of the persisting knowledge gaps. That is, we want to know how do we want to stimulate collaborative actions and how do we manage the supply and demand relationship for knowledge, for adaptation knowledge. And third, through the session, we want to extend an invitation to you, to new organizations who really want to partner in the LAKI to scale up adaptation action in the subregion. It is through this session and through our experts, we hope that we'd be able to showcase some of the examples of nature-based adaptation approaches in the Asia-Pacific region. So please feel free to jump in the chat box and interact with our experts, as well as our speakers. As I mentioned, should you have any questions, please type that at the bottom of the chat screen. You will find the Q&A box there, and throughout the session, we will try and respond to your queries. On this note, I would like to invite our first set of speakers, Aspen, Nira, Malia, and Moklesa. Please switch on your cameras and please stay on mute until it's time for you to speak. To a dear audience, just for you to know, you can view the speakers in full stream or gallery options. Please suggest this as you need to view the speakers. The four speakers that I've mentioned will be touching on nature-based solutions and examples and experience from the region. So let me first now introduce you our first panel member. Espen Rosenberg, he's the climate change advisor with the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. The SPREP is an intergovernmental organization in Samoa. Espen, you attended the last Pacific SIDS LAKI workshop that took place in February this year. Can you please share with us how the recent LAKI technical workshop has supported identification of adaptation knowledge barriers in the Pacific subregions, but also share your experience in how you see nature-based solutions closing some of the adaptation gaps. Espen, over to you.
Okay, Bula Vinaka, Alvin, Talofa Lava, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for that, Alvin. It was a very interesting experience, but I'd like to kind of preface it by lodging this conversation in a practical example. You will know, of course, that SPREP has carried out a lot of practical adaptation projects in the Pacific Island region over the past decade, including on ecosystem-based adaptation. We do prefer that terminology of nature-based solutions, of course. But in the interest of time, I just wanted to bring up one example that really resonates with the findings of the Pacific LAKI workshop. And I'll explain as I go along. But let me just tell the story first, because this is a Talanoa, so we'll move it along like that. So in 2009, SPREP commenced the Jeff-funded Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change project, which aimed at implementing on-the-ground adaptation in 13 Pacific Island countries. So each country selected a sector from amongst food security, water resources, coastal infrastructure. And I'm bringing up the example of Palau because they selected food security. They were experiencing saline intrusion into their coastal taro plantation. And taro is a very important traditional staple food throughout the Pacific, but also in Palau. The project initially sought to sort of trial out different varieties of salt-resistant taro, but the project team also found that some work was needed to sort of control the water issues. So some levees and water flow diversions were needed. So it took on board some of the water resource management aspects that some of the other countries were working on, but that were not specifically targeted for Palau. In addition, it was agreed that an additional safeguard would be introduced by replanting mangroves in the coastal fringe around the plantations. So the project was interesting as the taro plantation, that's the domain of women in that community. Men are not allowed in there at all. And a series of special meetings of the women farmers were therefore needed to grant sort of dispensation for the men to carry out some of this heavy work that was required. That dispensation was given once. Several suitable taro varieties were identified, and 3 were selected later after a taste test, which was of course very important. It just so happened that these were Palauan varieties, which was helpful. The water management measures were also very successful in that saline intrusion was markedly decreased. Also, of course, assisted by the wave stopping actions of the mangroves that quickly grew very healthy. And in addition, the women taro farmers were also given culinary and nutrition training for value adding to their agricultural outputs. But the mangroves had an unexpected, well, I say unexpected, we really shouldn't have not expected this. But anyway, it had the unexpected effect of bringing in an abundance of mud crabs to the area, which is not only a local delicacy, but these can sell for US $50 in the tourism sector, which is quite a large sector in Palau. And given that the taro sells for about US $5 to $10 for a bunch in the local market, there was all of a sudden sort of quite a major windfall for these women farmers. Now, when we had the Pacific LAKI workshop, we identified the lack of gender disaggregated data as a major gap. And this would have been very useful to have in order to understand how this particular project would impact on socio-economic relations in the community, which it most certainly did. It also links to the social protection issues related to gender, as women certainly were agents for major change in this project, yet how that was perceived was not properly accounted for. There are also links to the gaps around infrastructure and human settlements, in that the immediate solution could have simply focused on the mangroves. And it's been suggested that the water management aspects were really made redundant, at least in the near to medium term. So this links to a number of the knowledge gaps that we identified in the Pacific workshop around the coastal island dynamics and the interactions between coastal ecosystems, coastal vegetation, and the shoreline and the waves and so on. So in conclusion, I think that this practical examples are looking back at what we've done in adaptation. It validates what the Pacific LAKI workshop found to be clear knowledge gaps in the region. And we probably would have done things somewhat differently had we had some of these insights that we got from the workshop. But it also calls attention to the need for inclusive and interdisciplinary attention in the planning phases of projects. We need to ask the right questions from the right people, but also we need to gather multiple perspectives on what the problem is and what the perceived solution might be from those different perspectives. And how does that link in with what each group or community has as aspirations for a resilient future? It's not enough to simply conduct consultations for the sake of it. We need to ask some tough questions. And I think the LAKI workshop listing of knowledge gaps that we identified and that we will be working on going forward, I think that's going to be a very helpful tool for us, provided, of course, that we can operationalize it in practice when we go back to work with the community. So I'm sorry it was a bit of a talanoa. I was told not to do a PowerPoint presentation, which I deeply appreciated. I thought I would tell this story instead and bring it back to what the Pacific LAKI workshop was focused on. Thanks.
Thanks, Aspen, and your story is much appreciated, particularly the practical examples from Palau. Coming from Fiji, I know how important taro is, and the practical example on resilient varieties of taros is a really good example in the agriculture sector and adaptation. And Malia, in this session, will also talk about some of the agriculture and traditional knowledge in this area. So Aspen, your story in Talanoa is much appreciated. I would like to turn on to our next speaker now, Neera Shrestha-Pradhan. She's Senior Water and Adaptation Specialist. She's based at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICMOD in short. She has served as a regional member of the Hindu Kush Himalayan Initiative. Neera, I understand that you've been part of the LAKI prioritization workshop in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. This workshop was held about 5 years ago. So since that workshop, what progress has been made to close some of the adaptation gaps? Neera, over to you.
Thank you, Elvin. As you know, ICMOD works in 8 different countries in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, Myanmar in the east to Afghanistan in the west. So it has a diverse climate and issues in this region, and knowledge gap being one of the major challenge in this region. So in order to fulfill this knowledge gap, LAKI is one of the pathways that we have taken in our region. And if you look at, as you mentioned, LAKI Knowledge Gap Priority Setting Workshop was organized in 2016 together with our partners in the region. And we came out with 16 priority gaps in the region in different topics like forest and biodiversity, water, agriculture, health, etc., and different types of knowledge gaps. So after that, what we did was in 2017, as a follow-up process of LAKI Priority Workshop, we organized a satellite event at ICIMOD together with all the partners and discussed on the importance of use of knowledge. So there we came out with different action pledges and we submitted it to NWP. So this action pledge was also important for us to monitor where we are and where we are going, you know, what we are doing and where we are going. So it's kind of stick to monitor where we are going. And there, for examples, we have taken some nature-based solutions, trying to go to nature-based solutions through disaster risk resilience methods, early warnings, you know, and ecosystem services, spring shed management are some of the examples what we have done. And we are monitoring through our different projects and initiatives that we are doing at ICIMOD. Then, in 2019, ICIMOD came out with a state-of-the-art report on Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment, which is a major breakthrough, we should say, you know, to fulfill the data gap and the knowledge gap in our region. And with this Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment report brought in more than 200 scientists in this region and external also, international scientists also, and came out with try to fill in this knowledge gap. And then in 2020, a virtual ministerial summit was organized by ICIMOD, and where we the commitment, highest level of commitment from eight countries of our region to implement what is given in the gaps, you know, to fulfill the knowledge gap. So that's where we came out with HKH call to action. So with the HKH call to action, what we are doing now is going to different countries to have the discussion for the implementation of different actions that we want to implement in the region. But besides that, recently we are also working with university students on this capstone project, which is also looking at different issues in this region to fulfill the knowledge gap. So with this series of successful events working after the LAKI prioritization workshop, you know, we are able to, with our partners, I would emphasize here, it's not only ICIMOD, but with our regional member country partners, we are able to at least fulfill some of the knowledge gaps, but still there are a lot to fulfill, you know. So that is why we are very much looking into what Yusuf said in the keynote speech, the LAKI phase 2. And I would like to mention here that ICIMOD is very much committed and interested to join hands in this LAKI phase 2 also, so that it's not only about the partnership with LAKI and UNFCCC and UNEP, but also for us, you know, it is fulfilling the knowledge gap and for our regional member countries to address their SDG country goals, which is also important for us while we are fulfilling this knowledge gap through different forums. Thank you, Alvin, over to you.
Thanks, Neera. There was a very rich set of information coming from the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. I heard you talk about solving transboundary knowledge gaps. For the benefit of our audience, those who are setting up transboundary knowledge networks and cross-country knowledge gaps, what would you say would be the 2 key tips for them to set up this kind of knowledge networks, particularly partnership across countries?
Across the countries, you know, ICIMOD is working with different countries and experts, especially to fulfill the knowledge gap. You know, like we have knowledge forums and networks. For example, we have Indus Basin, Upper Indus Basin Knowledge Forum, Koshi Knowledge Hub, you know, Koshi Disaster Knowledge Hub. So these are the forums where you can bring in experts and participants from different countries in one forum where we can discuss the issues of common concern. So this is one of the pathways that we can take to fulfill the knowledge gap, because there we can share information. Sometimes it is difficult, you know, to go to the field and implement, but these are the forums where people come and share their knowledge and we learn from each other. So the other thing I would like to say, when we're talking about transboundary or region, we tend to think at the highest level. But what our experience has shown on community-based flood early warning system working in India and Nepal border is that at the community level also, it is very important to look at the community level, the community networks, social networks, where we can share the information of early warning from upstream communities in Nepal to the downstream vulnerable communities in India, where they get enough lead time to save their lives and livelihoods. So this is in action on the ground. So two things. One is at the larger level, the networks that helps, the forums, networks that help bring science and knowledge together and share, but also at the local level, where we can count on the communities and social networks and local government line agencies to fulfill the knowledge gap. Over to you, Elvin.
Thanks, Neera. That's a very useful message. The last bit around using local knowledge and using local partnerships as a instrument for closing knowledge gaps. And to talk more about traditional knowledge, our next speaker, Malia Talakai. She is a natural resource officer and the gender focal point at the FAO sub-regional office for Pacific Islands in Samoa. Malia, you've heard from Aspen, the gender dimension on climate change initiatives in the Pacific region, but also from Neera, the importance of social networks and particularly local traditional networks. You have been part of the recent LAKI workshop too. I understand you're involved in developing traditional knowledge systems for addressing knowledge gaps in the Pacific region and particularly in the agriculture sector. Can you share with the audience your experience on how traditional and local knowledge systems can be drawn onto adaptation planning? Over to you, Malia. Sorry, Malia, you're on mute. Please unmute yourself. You're still muted.
I think I got it. So thank you very much, Alvin. The technology is not kind to me. First, I think I want to start my talanoa by just saying that I think when we look at traditional knowledge, it's important to understand that it consists of not only the information, but also the practices and the worldviews of people. So in the Pacific region, traditional knowledge has been built up and used for over a long period of time about the changes in the environment. And Pacific people have also developed strategies to cope with some of the changes. So in the Pacific, traditional knowledge has been used to help assist people to forecast and plan their daily activities, ranging from the use of biological signs, for example, astronomical signs, physical indicators, biological signs such as observing plant and animal behaviors and birds, using the astronomical signs such as the moon and stars, and physical observations, indicators such as the observing landscape, wind direction, and oceans. I started my premise by doing this as I remember as a child growing up in Tonga. I experienced my father would refer to bird behaviors and the use of wind directions as the indication that a depression or a cyclone is developing. These are traditional warning systems that have been passed from generation to him. And many Pacific countries still continue to use these traditional knowledge, especially to forecast, prepare, cope with natural disasters. These also help to build the resilience of our communities. So also looking at traditional knowledge, I think there's a variety of contexts that it also refers to, and this could include biodiversity, architecture, and agriculture. In Tonga, for example, its traditional calendar was based on the phases of the moon, and it pretty much determined the time for planting and cultivation, especially of yams, which is Tonga's most important crop. In terms of FAO's work, the traditional knowledge and knowledge of Indigenous people are very key to the work that we do. And it can be drawn to support in adaptation planning and action in a number of ways. Traditional knowledge holders, owners are key to the consultation, the planning, and implementation of projects and programs in their community. So this is also quite key for the work that we do in FAO. Its inclusion in climate change assessments and understanding of local climate variability is also key, as it helps explain scientific forecasting, including the translation of scientific information. But I think one key element to that is also the translation of those information into the local languages. This is something that we recently tried to do in an AgroMet project that we did here in Samoa, which the project developed, looked at using Indigenous knowledge and AgroMet information, but also into bulletins, but also translating those bulletins into the local Samoan languages. So there's more increase in the uptake and access to information. Building upon, I think, building upon existing practices, but also reviving the traditional knowledge is also key. Is also key, and this is also part of the work that we also do. Support the use of traditional knowledge to promote rural development and gender equity. I think Espen also touched on some of these examples and also mentioned these, but also using sustainable management agro-ecosystem to support farmers and fishers. I think it's also key to promote the international interdisciplinary collaboration, especially to strengthen the interface between the traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge, including technology. Finally, I think, but last but not least, is the inclusion of Indigenous and traditional knowledge into community adaptation projects. I think Espen also touched on this, and this is also a key element into the work that we do, but also in terms of project design, implementation, and M&E in the work that we do here in FAO. So I think looking at the role of traditional knowledge in terms of adaptation, I think it's undoubtedly clear that its value is significant and important to reach the communities and to build their resilience. I think also touching on the most recent Pacific LAKI workshop, Espen touched on some of the discussion. But in relation, I think, to traditional knowledge, this was quite clear in some of the gaps that were brought up in the discussion, particularly in relation to traditional knowledge in infrastructure and human settlement, the institutional strengthening, also in agriculture, land use. These are some of the areas in the LAKI workshop linking to the traditional knowledge in these areas were identified as some of the knowledge gaps. And I think research in the Pacific region also points to the limited amount of information. There's work that's been done, but it's not enough, and the need to enhance those bridging those knowledge gaps in the Pacific. So I will stop there for now, Alvin. Thank you.
Thanks, Malia. Your Talanoa and your stories brought back a lot of memories around how as kids back in Fiji, we used to observe breadfruit and ant to determine, what type of weather, but also extreme events would be occurring. So thanks on that point. Colleagues and participants, I'd like to encourage that at the end of the screen, you see a Q&A button over there. Please feel free to type in your questions. I will be returning to those questions very, very soon after our next panelist has spoken. So connecting to what Malia had talked about on connecting with local communities through different approaches, our next speaker, Mokhlesa Rahman, he's the Executive Director for the Center for Natural Resources Studies based in Bangladesh. It's a national NGO. Mokhlesa, I understand, thank you for joining us. I understand from our conversation that the center has been working with national NGOs on transformative local adaptation to climate change. Can you please share with the audience what roles local organizations can play in aligning supply and demand for adaptation knowledge, and particularly knowledge that can be useful to end users? Mokhlesa, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Alvin. Sorry, I had some initial difficulty to join the program, but succeeded. Actually, the NGOs in Bangladesh are very vibrant in the climate-related activities, particularly the adaptation-related interventions. I think lots of NGOs are working at different places within Bangladesh, particularly what we call the climate hotspot areas, the coastal zone and the dry zone and the wetland zone. But in terms of the knowledge gap, what I have understood that the NGOs, definitely they are very vibrant in it and very engaged, but I think the conceptual understanding, clarity is still a gap among the implementers and definitely at the end users. For example, people talk about climate change. If you go to the village, you talk and then they would say that, well, it is because of the climate change. But what is climate change? What it is now and what will be in future? What are the future threats? That sort of understanding I have found lacking in different stakeholders and also at the with the end users. For example, I mean the adaptation science saying that the exposure, sensitivities, and adaptive capacity, these three components are very important. So what we need to do is reducing the level of exposures and sensitivities to climate related attributes and build the adaptive capacity. If we can do this simultaneously, then we can achieve towards reaching the adaptation goals and objectives. So this conceptual clarity is lacking, although we have been doing lots of adaptation programs in Bangladesh. The other thing I would like to highlight, most of the adaptation programs are sectoral and kind of segmented, like people working on water for the adaptation, but mainly focusing on where in the coastal area we have lots of problem with water. We have more water, we have saline water, we have less water, we have serious lack of water for drinking and also for irrigation and food production. But mostly focusing now, we are a partner of UNDP's GCF project, but that's mostly focusing on drinking water and other livelihood activities. But water has multiple use and is for nature, it's for irrigate food production, it's for livestock, it's for fisheries, it's for wildlife. So in a rural society, people are dependent on diverse activities. So they're dependent on the landscape production systems, or in other words, landscape, water and land-based production systems. So what we need is the building the resilience at the social ecological level, not that only we touch upon the society alone or a single production system alone. we need to integrate everything in a context. The supply and demand, if we talk about, mostly the way we design our projects, or we become partner of the government donor supported projects, that everything is decided. So what we have to do is to implement those at the front line, being the NGO. Often that, the contextualization, like if we do a project in the coastal area, there are lots of variations there. We have 710 kilometers of coastline, but have 3 or 4 more zones within it. And the features, the morphological features, the land cover, land use, and people's livelihood has a different, there are different approaches and different type of practices they prefer, or they have been doing over years. So we need to contact, if it's a coastal area, then we need to have the specific adaptation actions that meet the local demands. So that, I think, supply and demand side, there are also some knowledge level misconceptualization or lack of understanding that how it should be contextualized and how it could better contribute to achieve the adaptation goals. Other thing is that, since if we mostly do in agriculture, where there are different actors involved in it. So it's not that only the Department of Agriculture should be the main actor from the government side, but also we need the water sector, the fisheries sector, livestock sector, and the agricultural sector, and also the land. So this, it is difficult often to have better coordinated approach among these ministries or departments from the government, and making bridges with the local communities and local actors. So there we need to work to harmonize, so that all the actors can talk the same thing and work to achieve the adaptation goals. So NGOs basically, the capacity and understanding of the adaptation in a broader term, we are talking about transformative adaptation, but we don't know what it is. Many of us, we have no clarity about this. So there are different continuum of adaptations suggested by the adaptation experts like Mark Palin and Christophe Bene. They have good research papers on this. So they said that, there are 3 levels of adaptation: adaptation for coping, then absorbing capacity, then the transformative capacity, or adaptation for coping, and then transition, and then transformation. So we need to have better understanding that how we start with the coping and then absorbing capacity towards the transformative capacity. So what we need to reach, what is the pathways, and what are the important actions that we need to take place, both at the ground level, to the regional level, to the central level. Because transformative adaptation is something very big, challenging, and a total regime shift in the management systems, in the policy systems. So that, if we really want that, we need more time. We need more evidence-based case studies and briefings, demonstration results. Then we gradually can move towards that sort of, adaptation, transformative adaptations.
Sure.
So without having...
Mr. Rahman, I just want to let you know that you're running a little bit over time, but very succinctly in very one quick takeaway message. How do we connect NGOs, particularly addressing NGO-based actions, to address nature-based solutions? And if you can just give a takeaway message on that.
All right. We are talking about nowadays nature-based solutions, and we also have experience of implementing the nature-based solution approaches. The first thing is that in Bangladesh now, it's globally as well, that ICAD Center in Bangladesh, jointly with the Oxford University, organized some workshops and webinars on adaptation, NBS. The problem, and IUCN is also working on that. The problem is that still this NBS knowledge is limited within a very few people. Those have access to webinars and this sort of forum, but the communities and the vast number of frontline actors or the players of the NGOs are out of this knowledge system, of this discussion platform. So what is important is that we need to collectivize this, and we also need strategies and actions and guidelines that what is NBS and what are the pathways of implementing NBS, and also need the monitoring, the results or experience of NBS, how it works, and whether these nature-based solutions, why it is better compared to gray solutions or green-gray solutions. So we need to have this sort of evidences and understanding, and then we can communicate this to our policy stakeholders so that we get the support from the government to facilitate this at the ground level. And the sub-district level and district level government officials who are basically responsible for implementing adaptations, they also need to have the understanding of transformative adaptations, overall adaptation framework, and also the nature-based solution approaches.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's, I want to hear now.
Thanks, Mukhtar. I mean, that's a lot of rich information on other persisting and almost like sticky knowledge gaps that are, still out there despite action on closing these adaptation gaps. I see that there's a lot of questions, rich questions that are coming from the audience. And very quickly, I'd like to turn my attention to some of the questions that have been posed by our audience. Nira, there is a follow-up question, and this is particularly relating to how you've engaged with key sectors. One of the questions that our participant says is, how were the key actors and organizations identified in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region to begin working to close the knowledge gaps? So are you able to answer this very quickly? Over to you, Nira.
Thank you, Alvin. One of the main mandate of ECMOD is we don't work directly in the countries or on the ground. We work together with our partners. So that is the main thing. Partnership is very important for us. Selection of partners, there are different level of partners that we work with, like the government partners, where we mainly work with them at the policy level. But also the NGO partners, with whom we implement the activities and the work. But also at the local level, we also work with the local government line agencies and local community-based organizations to implement actions on the ground. So we have a partnership unit at ECMOD, which looks into what type of partners are relevant to work at various levels because of the work that we are doing at various levels. But also not only that, at the regional level also there are regional partners. But the main benefit of ECMOD is we can bring in different partners from different countries together in one platform and to share our knowledge, But also at the global level, accordingly, we select partners accordingly. Alvin, there is one more question on that is posed to me, I think, on what are some of the reasons that make certain knowledge gap hard to fill. So let me quickly in one sentence make answer to this question is one of the main reason in our Hindu Kush Himalaya region is the sharing of data when we have to specially talk about water, so that is the major constraint that is really, having constraining us to close this knowledge gap, but also scarcity of data in this region. That's why if you look at the HKH assessment report, we try to fill in this gap. And one of the other region is also translating, the policy and science into practice. So that is also one of the reason I think, which is really hampering to fulfill or close this knowledge gap. Thank you, Elvin.
Thanks, Nira. That was a very rich response. We're beginning to see a lot of questions that are coming through. Espen, I'd like to turn the attention now to your story. So there was a very insightful story about climate resilient agriculture in Palau, and often we get this question around methods. Are you able to very briefly talk to the audience about what kind of technical methods we should be using to identify adaptation knowledge gaps, and maybe how did you go about using this method? Over to you, Espen.
Well, I think the main aspect here is to ensure that we talk to all the stakeholders and talk to them in settings in which they are comfortable to express themselves. Alvin, you are of course very familiar with how things are in the Pacific. Maybe some of the rest of the audience are not. I'm sure there are similar constraints in other countries as well. But I mean, just to give an example, when we're consulting around adaptation options, it's not sufficient to speak to the village leaders. You also need to speak to the different groups. You need to engage with the women's groups. And the example I raised from Palau, if you hadn't spoken to the women's groups, you most certainly wouldn't have had a viable project. It's also important to speak to the youth and get their perspectives in this. And it's really, if we are going to have a viable adaptation project or intervention going forward, it needs to have that really in-depth consultation and knowledge backing it up. That's it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, certainly we need to then engage the right interlocutors to go in and become those knowledge brokers with the communities. And it's not necessarily something that requires a PhD or anything like that. It's being activist, being knowledgeable about the situation, but most certainly being connected to the community or the element of the community that we want to gather their information, gather their insights, and gather their perspectives from. In terms of closing the knowledge gaps, I think this idea of knowledge brokerage is becoming quite important for us in the Pacific. It's the role of a lot of people, and it like I said, this is not a PhD type of job. It's something that a lot of us can do with the people that we are connected to. I certainly wouldn't be able to go and speak to the women's groups and the youth groups that I've spoken to here in Samoa. They just think I'm too old and a dinosaur, so we need somebody else to do the job. But I can certainly advise somebody on what they should be bringing in terms of information. But doing that part is not my job. I can't do it.
Sure. That's a very key point, Espen, around, in addition to method approaches, particularly if you're looking at a particular segment of the community, how do you, approaches that are useful to consult with these vulnerable segments of community. I think that's also a very important point over here in terms of closing the adaptation knowledge gaps. Malia, I'd like to turn my attention to you. There is a question from our audience in terms of what are the barriers and opportunities that prevent engagement with traditional knowledge holders. Are you very briefly able to talk about maybe one or two key barriers you found from your work and your experience in the Pacific? Malia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alvin. I think just touching on I think one of the barriers that I see in terms of the use of traditional knowledge, specifically in terms of climate change adaptation, is sometimes I think there's the value of traditional knowledge as a means or as an approach to adaptation is not it's not valued as much as scientific knowledge. It's often undervalued in relation to scientific knowledge. Also, there's a lack of and limited attempts in terms of collection of the different types of coping strategies, not only the traditional knowledge in terms of coping strategies, but also the social protection angle, I think, that comes with traditional knowledge. Those areas, I think, research in the Pacific has also touched on this. And I know that SPREP also has a good program that looks at collecting the different traditional knowledge used in climate change, in the context of climate change, but also looking at coping strategies. So I think that's work, very important work that will assist in closing the knowledge gaps.
Thank you, Malia. That is a very good point around the value of local knowledge. And on that point, I'd like to quickly turn my attention to the next and the last question. And I'd like to pose this to Mokhlesa Rahman. What is the role of NGOs in terms of connecting local communities and transmitting local knowledge to, say, maybe national policy processes? How can local NGOs and local-based organizations help address, this gap?
Thank you, Alvin. Briefly, actually, we are at the front line and interact with the communities and local knowledge holders. And if we are active, I mean, the way we do basically when we start a program or project in a site, we do a kind of, as I said, that biophysical and socioeconomic assessment, which is more like, the social ecological resilience status. And then we look at what are the local practices and local knowledges. Just to give you two examples, in one project in the wetland area, the large wetland management, we didn't have the watershed in our program, not even the proposals, and no money for that. But when we started community interactions at the outset of the project, then they said you must include the hills around and the hill slopes, because the current hill slope practice for farming is very dangerous for the wetlands. If we really want to protect the wetlands, we need to incorporate that. We communicated this through our international partners to the USAID. Fortunately, USAID included that and put some additional money to handle that. So that's a vivid example of integrating local knowledge and transmitting it to the policy stakeholders. The other aspect is, currently we are doing a small project in the coastal area that's funded by the Climate Justice Resilient Fund, and we supplied. There are areas that people suffer from waterlogging and that damage their monsoon rice. So we have got a good variety that can tolerate the inundation, and that worked well on the ground. But the women folk gave us the feedback. It's fine that the rice variety is quite good and can sustain the inundation, but it is not tasty. Our children don't like it. So what we did, we transmitted this to Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, that, well, it's very good variety, people like it, but the taste is not good. So, I mean, maybe, and I suggested that, well, we also need to, the cultural aspects to be embedded in the invention of the varieties. So there are examples that we do this, and it really works. Most often it works. Thanks.
Thank you, Moklesa, for answering that question. Dear audience, colleagues, we've run out of the Q&A session for our panelists, but I'd like to encourage you to keep those questions coming in. Type your questions in the Q&A box, and our speakers will get to you on your questions. Thank you to all the panel speakers for this very rich discussion and very practical examples on closing knowledge gaps related to adaptation and nature-based solutions. So at this stage, I would like to request the speakers to please switch off your cameras. I now move on to our next set of respondents and speakers, Christopher and Sering. These are experts from Vanuatu and Bhutan. I would like you to please switch on your cameras. And when we move on to the reflections and exchange in part 2, please free to unmute yourself and talk. So dear audience, this is the most interesting part of, one of the most interesting part of the session. We will now move on to session 2, where we will encourage and request your interaction and engagement via menti.com. So if you haven't done so yet, please open your browser on your computer, or if you're using your mobile phone on there, and type in www.menti.com and use the code 17887035. I repeat, 17887035. So use this code to log on to menti.com, and we will now interact with you. Regina from Climate Secretariat, are you please able to bring up the first Menti slide, please? So the first Menti question. I have experience in scaling up adaptation actions, including nature-based solutions. So we are looking at unpacking, translating, and repackaging adaptation knowledge. I can see that we've got at least 7 individuals who have experience in translating and repackaging adaptation knowledge. And slowly, I can see that we are also have quite a lot of practitioners and colleagues who have experience working across different sectors, and something that Malia had talked about, sectoral adaptation knowledge gaps. And this is quite useful as countries are developing the national adaptation plans to be aware of this sectoral gaps in knowledge. In contrast, what we can see on the screen is that access to finance from public and private sector still remains a key. Well, there is an experience, but also appears to be, a key gap in terms of addressing knowledge gaps. So this is a very interesting feedback from the audience. Regina, are you able to move on to the second Menti slide, which is talking about sectoral approach? And colleagues, participants, please log on to menti.com, and I'd like to hear from you. What experience do you have working in cross-sectoral adaptation actions? We're looking at agriculture, land use planning, water sector, health sector, forestry, and other sectors. Interesting. Many of the national adaptation plans are prioritizing agriculture and water as a key area for adaptation solutions. And I can see that agriculture and water similarly have very high in terms of experience of practitioners. These are 2 sectors where I can see there's a large number of concentration. On the other hand, health sector remains to be poorly addressed. It seems that there's still a lot to do in the health sector, and similarly in other sectors. And other sectors could include cross-linkages with the existing ones, or those that have not been mentioned over here. Very rich point on your experience working in cross-sectoral adaptation actions. So now I'd like to invite our discussant, Christopher and Sering, to please switch on your cameras. And for the first two Menti questions, I'd like to request Christopher, if you can take the floor, maybe in 1 minute to reflect on this. So Christopher Bartlett is a special advisor on climate change for the Ministry of Climate Change in Vanuatu. Christopher, seeing from the Menti slides, what are your very quick reflections on the responses from our audience? Over to you, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alvin, and great to be here from a very remote part of Vanuatu here in the Pacific Islands. So I see that this idea of translating and repackaging adaptation knowledge seems to resonate with quite a few people. And my experience here in Vanuatu is that that is absolutely the case. I think probably in my experience, one of the most important parts of filling adaptation knowledge gaps isn't about creating new knowledge, but it's about tailoring knowledge that exists. And particularly here in Vanuatu, in communities that don't have access to financial or technical resources, adaptation knowledge that's based on nature and the environment is the most accessible, the easiest, the most aligned to, I would say, village livelihoods and lived experience. I can give you a very quick example here in Vanuatu. The Met Services, the Departments of Climate Change, they provide bleaching warnings for coral reefs, and they go out on the radio and say there's a bleach warning, but they don't really make that knowledge actionable. And so the local NGO network that I've been working with is tailoring that bleaching warning to very simple messages for chiefs and traditional authorities who are already acting to protect the environment by placing taboos or harvest restrictions over coral reefs. So they take that simple message that now there's a time to put a taboo for the next 3 months or the next month, whatever the warning says, and then fishermen can actually understand, okay, now we can leave off fishing for the next month. So I think this reflection about brokering, and Espen brought this up, is absolutely essential for filling knowledge gaps. And certainly in the Pacific, it resonates very much using traditional knowledge in alignment with scientific knowledge that's coming out so that people can take real action that's relevant to their day-to-day activities.
Thanks, Christopher. That's again very rich experience, and I really like the point you've made on tailoring knowledge from lived experiences. In your response, when you've been involved in LAKI priority setting workshop for the Pacific region, very briefly, can you tell us what potential role do you see for nature-based adaptation actions in closing these knowledge gaps, particularly from Vanuatu and other small islands in the region?
Yeah, thanks for that, Alvin. So we had the LAKI workshop in the Pacific just a week ago. And it was very interesting to see the areas of adaptation knowledge gaps that emerged. And nature-based solutions really did rank highly in our work. And I think the reason that it ranked highly is because nature, living with nature is such a daily experience with so many communities in the Pacific. I mean, everything from the food that you eat to the building materials used for your houses to the medicines that you take don't come from any store or not imported, but literally come from your forest in the back or the reef out the front of the village. So this emerged heavily from the LAKI workshop. And what's so important about nature is that it's got flow in by protecting and enhancing the capacities of the ecosystem to function normally. You've got then flow on benefits of adaptation. So a forest protected area, for example, increasing the stream flow to the village during a drought, or a reef protected area, for example, providing more food security or protection from storm swell. So this really came out as an area of high importance in the Pacific, is nature-based solutions, traditional knowledge around nature, and then the links to adaptation, the benefits to adaptation.
Thank you, Christopher. And wow, there's very rich knowledge coming from the Pacific region, particularly from this workshop. Colleagues, I would like to now move on to the third Menti slide. So we talked about in the first Menti slide that finance still remains a key challenge to addressing the knowledge gaps. So in your experience, what are the main obstacles to mobilize climate finance and resources to address knowledge barriers? So audience participants, please feel free to jump onto menti.com. We'd like to hear from you. What are the obstacles to mobilize climate finance? And I can see the first being corruption being an issue, government. Yes. No finance for loss and damage. I know that loss and damage remains a key potential area of focus for small island developing states, particularly that in the Pacific, proposal writing, red tapes, complicated application process, very valid points, and lack of interest from the private sector. There's a lot of experiences in private sector engagement in Vanuatu and in many parts of the Asia-Pacific region. Private sector, again, in terms of understanding of their role and long, lengthy forms. I think this is, these are very practical examples of the main obstacles in the climate finance world. Please keep that coming in. Roger, can we move on to the third slide, please? Oh, sorry, before we move on to the final Menti slide, can I bring in Sering Yongsom? She's the Senior Environment Officer at the Climate Change Division in National Environment Conservation in Bhutan. Sering, what do you make out of what we are hearing from the audience in terms of the challenges to finance and resources in terms of addressing knowledge barriers? Sering, over to you.
Thank you, Alvin. I think before I directly jump into your question, I just wanted to share the story from our side. For all the times, for centuries, Bhutanese have, preserved our natural resources because we live in harmony with nature and our tradition. I think our traditional and local beliefs promoted the conservation of our environment. For example, the key ecological sites like mountains, rivers, or be it forest, we believe them to be homes for goddesses, protective deities, or underworld spirits, and we believe that any disturbances or pollution to these sites would result in death, disease, or famine. So, this unique relationship between the Bhutanese people and the nature, it has been built within, moral, cultural, and ecological boundaries, and we have been respecting these boundaries, which has been ensured historically through a set of formal and informal rules and norms. And even, the constitution of the kingdom ensures that we maintain 60% of forest cover for all times to come. And even the development philosophy that governs the developmental activities in Bhutan, we take our environment as core to our development, because environment conservation is one of the 4 pillars of our gross national happiness, which is the guiding development philosophy in the country. So, any activity that we implement, any adaptation or any conservation efforts, we focus them around nature, because we want to ensure that we are in harmony with nature and our cultural values. So this is why Bhutan has always been proactive when it comes to nature-based solutions. And so far, Bhutan has accessed a lot of finance, mainly through multilateral fundings like GCF, JEF LDCF, and other bilateral and donor supports. In fact, you might be aware that Bhutan is one of the first LDC parties to prepare and submit our NAPA, National Adaptation Program of Actions, to UNFCCC in 2006, and we were the first one to implement NAPA 1 in 2007 with funding support from JEF LDCF. Similarly, we have also implemented NAPA 2 for the 4 years with, again, funding support from GCF, JEF LDCF. And currently, Bhutan is also implementing the NAPA 3 project with financial support from JEF LDCF, and also implementing, the National Adaptation Plan with funding support from GCF. And where we have attracted funding, we have always focused, we have designed our projects across multiple sectors. For example, the urban ecosystem-based adaptation that Bhutan is currently implementing in partnership with Thimphu Thomde, which is a municipality of the capital city. we have looked into ways to connect, for example, like we are trying to produce organic waste from organic compost from food waste, and using it for urban agriculture purposes, and also recycling plastic waste to produce fencing poles and tree stakes, which could be used for revegetation projects. So we find that, including multiple sectors, it's attractive to donors as well as beneficial when it comes to implementing. And we have also tried to identify and quantify benefits across, environment, social, and economic aspects. We find that it helps to design projects to maximize benefits for the disadvantaged section of the society, such as providing job for the unemployed youth or business opportunities for women. Projects that can, demonstrate social and economic benefits while improving the environment. These sort of projects are more likely to get funding support from foreign donors as well as within Bhutan. Yep, Alvin, I want to end my answer here.
Thanks, Serene. I do have a follow-up question for you, but before I do that, can we move on to the last Menti slide? And as we are populating, as the audience, they're populating the Menti question, which is focusing on partnership, I will turn on my follow-up question for Serene. So the last Menti question focuses on what does a good partnership entail to close adaptation knowledge gaps. So we'd like to hear from you, what does a good partnership actually look like? But Serene, as a follow-up, you mentioned that Bhutan has already formulated its national adaptation plan. How did you translate going from your UNEP to actual investment projects? What was one key success? If you can share in one practical example, how did you go from your UNEP to actual investments in country, and particularly investments in nature-based solutions?
Sorry, Alvin, because of some internet issues, I didn't get your question. Can you repeat your question, please?
Sure. So you mentioned that Bhutan has already formulated its national adaptation plans, and you've already developed NAPA 1, NAPA 2, NAPA 3 projects. How did you, what is the success to translate your your NEP to investment proposals? Serene? Okay, we'll pose on that question over there. What I'd like to turn now is turn to the
Sorry.
Serene. Yes, we can hear you. Did you want to?
Thank you, Alvin. Excuse me. I'm sorry with the very poor internet connection in here, but if I got you correctly, I think you were asking about, formulation of NAP, right? The NAP readiness project. We have not finished formulating, but we are in the process of formulating the NAP project, and the priorities within the NAP project is, enhancing coordination, learning, and knowledge management for an iterative NAP process. Also looking at enhancing capacity building for generating climate scenario and impact assessments. And most importantly, we want to undertake vulnerability assessment to identify and prioritize adaptation options, and eventually to have this now formulated with focus on the water sector. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, Serene, that's very useful in terms of translating your NEP into concrete adaptation priorities and investments. So audience colleagues, what you're seeing on the screen is the last Menti question, which is focusing on partnerships. So what does a good partnership really look like to close adaptation knowledge gaps? And what I can see on the screen, engagement with community is something that Moklesa and Malia talked about, trust in mutual respect based on long-term relationship, empathy, hand in hand with partners. So some of the approaches that Espen had also mentioned, that approaches are quite important in terms of addressing knowledge gap. Sure, I can see win-win partnership, empowerment particularly of local communities. These are some very rich inputs coming from the audience. Thank you. That's pretty much the end of the part 2 of the Menti discussions, and I'd like to thank Christopher and Sering for your input. At this point, I'd like to invite the audience. If you have any pending questions, we have about 5 to 6 minutes in terms of answering these questions. We do have an open question over here. And Mr. Rahman, this is more towards you. The question is, thanking you for your experience. What the audience would like to know is, what would you think is a good strategy to connect different ministries and agencies in the government to work together on adaptation projects? Mokla, sir, over to you.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult, very difficult to have this inter-ministerial coordination. But I think when it should be started from the project designing, I'm talking about the a bit larger projects. When a project is designed, basically they are aligned to a single ministry. Like, say, for the wetlands, we have different ministries engagement: Ministry of Land, Ministry of Water, Fisheries, Forest, and Agriculture. But the project is aligned to Ministry of Fisheries because they think that wetland and fish. So we repeatedly reported back to the donors and in our project consultation meetings that at least the Ministry of Land and Forest should be engaged in place where, or it depending on the context. So otherwise, it's really very difficult. We really cannot. So from the beginning, when a project is in the design phase, we need to identify the stakeholders, particularly the ministerial level, and then how this interministerial body can be formed as a kind of maybe project steering committee, or what are the specific roles and responsibilities should be there, should be explicitly mentioned. Currently, one project is being developed by USAID, and we are in contact with US companies, and we suggested that if you don't take this, you really cannot achieve the full. So it is that's one point. Other point, at the ground level, at the sub-district and the district level, it is basically the district executive head and the sub-district executive head manages everything. So at the ground level, we need to collectivize this. And for example, in a wetland project under USAID funding, at the local level, we formed a multi-stakeholder local management committee, a kind of advisory committee. So if we have issues with the forest, if we have issues with agriculture, fisheries, and water, so at the sub-district level, we can resolve much of the problems. But many projects, they have only the central level coordination, but these very high up people, they talk good, but are not being translated to the field level situation. So if you have the field level, very vibrant and active committee engaging or integrating all the relevant ministry people who are at the front line, that can serve purposes. So that we experience. So that's basically when, and the design, it should be integrated project, not that a single sectoral project.
Sure.
Particularly in, yeah, so that's my suggestion.
Thank you for the response, Mr. Rahman. Dear audience participants, we're running 5 to 10 minutes over time. I would like to request an additional 5 to 10 minutes of your time as we close the session and wrap up with some key messages. In this vein, I would now like to turn to all the speakers and discussants. Dear speakers and discussants, I would like to give you this opportunity, 30 seconds, very brief in terms of what should be the takeaway points for our audience. And perhaps we can start with Aspen.
Thanks, Alvin. I would say that it's really all about integration, interdisciplinary, outreach to communities, knowledge brokerage, and getting the resources that's needed to the communities to undertake the actions based on the best available information, which may be based on traditional knowledge. It may be based on modern science. Doesn't really they're not really interchangeable. And I think that's really we need to be interdisciplinary, and we need to reach out as much as we can across ministries and agencies. Thank you.
Alvin, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Nira, sorry, your one takeaway message for the audience.
Thank you, Alvin. I think the key message I would like to give here is a meaningful and win-win partnership. I think that is the key to success in closing the knowledge gap. Just to briefly give an example of the UNFCCC and NWP university partnership that we worked with, and the work that we did with Harvard University really helped us a lot. It was students, but students came out with their master's thesis, whereas we got the policy brief from them, which we were looking for since long. So partnership could be at any level, but it should be win-win and meaningful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nira. Malia and Moklesa, over to you.
Well, I'm Moklesa. I think we talk about the nature-based solutions and EBA or ecosystem restorations, but one thing we need to keep in our mind that it's not the ecosystem, the ecology only, but also the society and the culture. So unless we engage effectively the different occupational groups in the society with the ecosystem restoration or the ecosystem-based adaptation, we really sometimes may create conflicts in the area. We may serve the purpose of the vested groups. So we need to equally give values to the society and also the ecosystems. And that's why I often say that we manage people to manage ecosystems. So we need to follow that, not that, well, only the ecosystem is our focus because it is EBA. So that's my message. Thank you.
Thank you, Moklesa. Malia. And you're on mute.
Okay, just quickly to wrap up, I think takeaway message from me, specifically on traditional knowledge and gender, for example. These are key to the adaptation actions, not only actions, but the development of policies and strategies. Yeah, so I think they're key, and actions to promote gender equality in climate change responses would also lead to positive effects in the implementation of other sustainable development goals. So I think partnership, as the others would have mentioned, but also the empowering of community, empowering of women to participate in not only the planning, but also the implementation of activities. Thank you.
Thanks, Malia. Serene and Christopher, any takeaway home messages for our audience?
Yes, I have one. Thanks so much again for the invitation to participate. Nature-based solutions are absolutely essential for adaptation. I think my key message is that we need, well, the LAKI process showed that we need more attention to nature-based solutions and filling knowledge gaps, but also finance for nature-based adaptation solutions. And when adaptation fails and we reach the thresholds of adaptation and our ecosystems fail because of climate change, we also need finance for loss and damage for ecosystems. So thanks very much again.
Thank you, Alvin. I have two takeaway messages here. Number one, when we go for vulnerability assessment, I think it is very important that we need to have this top-down approach of using this climate projections and then supplementing that with, the bottom-up approach of looking at socio-demographic profiling, like average household, female-headed households, number of elderly and children. Also the need to look at economic status of how many population is being engaged with climate-sensitive sectors, how many are unemployed, the poverty rate, and also it's very important to look at health issues and environmental degradations. So using these sort of non-climatic data can really help in identifying this vulnerability. And when it comes to proposing adaptation measures, I think it's very important to go for whole of the society approach, because it's very important that local communities are the ones who are really impacted by this climate change impact. So it's important to bring their concerns and their thoughts and concerns into this planning process, so that the adaptation measures that we propose will be they will have a sense of ownership and also ensure the sustainability of such programs. So thank you.
Thanks, Serene. This has been a really fantastic and very rich exchange of conversation. And as we call it in Pacific, a very fantastic rich Talanoa session. So very many thanks and much thanks to the panelists, including the participants. And we hope that this has been a very insightful event for you all. So in the past hour and a half, we heard of examples from the Pacific Islands subregion and the Hindu Kush Himalayan region and rest of Asia. So we heard of experiences from our colleagues from Nepal, Samoa, Vanuatu, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. And we were able to generate some really key insights from across the Asia Pacific region on how adaptation knowledge gaps are being closed and how partners are scaling up nature-based actions and what forms of partnerships are being created and generated and mobilized to close the adaptation gaps. And very quickly, I just want to summarize some of the key things that we've heard in the session. First, it was very thrilling to hear from the joint initiatives and commitments of partners in the region towards scaling the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiatives. We heard of interdisciplinary approaches. We heard of win-win partnerships in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. We also heard about societal-based approaches, and the societal context is important to nature-based solutions, particularly engaging with local communities, integrating traditional knowledge, translating knowledge into local language. And critical to this, of course, is the importance of finance, particularly finance to mobilize to close adaptation gaps, but also implement adaptation initiatives. So we also understand how, from this session, how to close persisting knowledge gaps. And as Mira talked about, and Aspen talked about experiences from the Pacific and the Hindu Kush region, new partnerships and new alliances are being developed to meet the supply and demand of knowledge adaptation gap. Finally, I think the panelists and the discussants feel that we need to continue to strengthen this partnership in the long term, particularly to engage for stakeholders from national government, from local and regional partners. As Nira talked about, importance of involving universities so that we can roll out nature-based adaptation solutions more widely in the Asia-Pacific region. So partnership initiatives through the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative, or the LAKI, is really an opportunity for closing some of these sticky knowledge gaps, particularly those that are persistent. The UNFCCC and the UN Environment Programme through the Global Adaptation Network now would like to take this opportunity to invite new organizations to partner in the context of Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative to scale up adaptation action in the different subregions. And as Yusuf mentioned, we all mentioned in the beginning of the session, we are beginning to see new alliances and new partnerships being generated. What do you see, Roji, if you're able to bring up the final slide, please? So on the slide, you will find more information how you can stay involved and in touch with the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiative through the different web portals, but also if you have questions, reach out to the Climate Secretariat team, Roji, Fatima at the Nairobi Work Program. They're fantastic team to work with, so please feel free to engage with them and reach out to them if you have questions or if you are willing to partner under the Lima Adaptation Knowledge Initiatives. Lastly, I'd like to invite participants and colleagues, please tune in to the first nature-based solution session at the APAN. It's called Harnessing Climate Technologies and Practices to Strengthen Nature-Based Resilience. So this session will run from 2 to 3:30 p.m. tomorrow. That's Thursday, 11th of March. Bangkok time, it will be 2 p.m. So this session will be led by UN Environment Program, CTCN, and they will explore the use of effectiveness of nature-based resilience approaches, particularly looking at leveraging innovative adaptation technologies. So colleagues, participants, audience, thank you again. Thank you again to the panelists and discussants, the APAN organizers, and all of you for joining us. Vinaka Vakalevu. Take care, and everyone have a good rest of the APAN forum. Thank you.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the next technical sessions beginning at 2 p.m. Bangkok time, focusing on communities and local and economic sectoral resiliences. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubilo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation and see you in the next sessions.